Hello, everyone. Here we have another guest presentation. This time, our guest presenter is Dr. Matthew Flummer. Dr. Flummer, can you introduce yourself to the people watching?
Yeah, sure. I am a professor at Porterville College up in the Central Valley, and I teach a variety of different philosophy classes. I did my PhD work at Florida State University, where I worked with Al Mealy and did a lot of stuff on free will. And while we were there, we hosted a Templeton grant for the big questions in free will that lasted a few years. And then the one after that was neuroscience and self-control. So there was a lot of opportunities to learn about the science, whereas in grad school I'm focusing so much on the philosophy. And if you guys will allow me for a shameless plug, a colleague and I started a podcast during the shutdown called The Free Will Show. So if you're interested in learning more about free will, we try to make it accessible to undergrads. We interview some of the best people in the world on philosophy, science, of free will, and the current season that we're focusing on is free will in the law.
Gotcha. Excellent. Excellent. All
All
righty
right,
then.
so you want me to just go ahead and get started?
Go ahead.
All right, I'm going to share my screen. Can you guys see this?
Yes.
All right, so the email I got from David asking me to come, he asked for evidence for free will and to talk about the neuroscientific argument against free will. So I'm going to divide my presentation up, probably not equally. I'm going to go through the evidence for free will pretty quickly. And then I'll spend the majority of my time talking about the neuroscientific argument against free will. And it's interesting that he asked about that question, the first part, the evidence for free will, because most people skip over that, and there's not a whole lot in the literature about evidence for free will. Most of the arguments that, if you start to read about it, are either giving some kind of a philosophical account of free will or dealing with arguments against free will. And so I thought it was interesting to think about some of these arguments. And if you're familiar, there's a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga who was asked about evidence for God, and he kind of had this quip, oh yeah, I can just run off a dozen or so arguments for the existence of God off the top of his head. And then that ended up being a book called A Dozen or So Arguments for the Existence of God. And so in that vein, I started to think about some really simple arguments that I could come up with as evidence for free will. But before we get into the arguments, I thought it would be helpful to just talk terminology a little bit, because especially when you start to read scientists and other disciplines who are talking about free will, it's not always clear that we're talking about the same thing. And we don't want to talk past one another and commit, the fallacy of equivocation. So in the free will literature, traditionally, these 2 points that you see on the screen have been kind of put forward as the common sense understanding of what free will is. So for a long time, free will was thought to be the ability to do otherwise, in the sense that you perform some action, like you go to the restaurant and you're choosing between the tacos and the cheeseburgers, and you decide that you're going to eat the tacos. Well, if you had free will, then if we kind of rewound time, you could have done other than you did at that moment in time. That's kind of the idea of the ability to do otherwise. And then sometimes it's cashed out in terms of control over our behavior. So this can be explained in several different ways, but it's generally thought to be related to certain things that we think that free will is good for, or free will is required for some other thing that we want. And so I'm going to focus a lot on the second part, that this kind of control that we have over our behavior, in my arguments for free will, or the evidence for free will. So another thing that we might want to ask before we talk about the evidence for free will is like, what even counts as evidence? Usually when I hear people say, well, is there actually any evidence for free will? There might be some kind of assumptions that it needs to be a certain kind of evidence, like empirical evidence or scientific evidence. And so it's an open question whether or not philosophical arguments will count as evidence. And so a lot of since I'm a philosopher, when you ask me for evidence, I'm going to give you some arguments. Some of them might have empirical aspects or scientific aspects, but the majority of them are going to be just philosophical arguments. And so I'll just go ahead and put the first one up here so you can see the kind of thing that I'm talking about. I've got, I think there's 9 of these arguments that I'm just going to run through really quick. I put the what I think is the best one first, and then there's a bunch of later ones. This argument is compelling to me, so I'm calling it the moral responsibility argument. And as we saw in the previous slide, if you define free will as a certain kind of control that we have over our behavior, a lot of people link free will to the control that's necessary to be morally responsible. And you can think about different kind of actions that you perform. And in some cases, we lack the kind of control that we would need to have over our behavior in order for someone to hold us morally responsible for what we do. So let me give you a couple of examples. So let's suppose that someone pushes me, like gives me a big shove, and as a result of that, I accidentally step on somebody else's foot. So I step on your foot, but I'm not in the right kind of control over my behavior, because once they push me, I kind of lose my balance. I'm not in control anymore. And although I did something to somebody else that might have caused them pain, we could say I shouldn't be held responsible for that because I don't have the right kind of control. Other examples typically introduced in this context include things like compulsion and constraint. So if you tie me up and then there's a person drowning in a pool next to me and you blame me for not saving the person drowning, well, I could say, well, I was constrained by the chains or the ropes that you tied me up with. I didn't have the control necessary to be able to do the thing, so I shouldn't be held responsible for it. Or if you put a gun to my head and compel me to do something, if I'm a bank teller and you put the gun to my head and tell me give me the money in the register or I'm going to kill you, then usually that's the kind of thing, like the compulsion that undermines the being held responsible for actions like that. So, all right. So free will is the control necessary to be morally responsible is our first premise. If we just accept that as like an assumption for the sake of the argument, and then we think about, for premise 2, at least some people are morally responsible for what they do. The idea here is just think about your everyday experiences when you interact with people. And in some cases, people do things that you might consider as morally bad, or in some terminology you might think of as blameworthy. And it seems like to me that this, if I know anything philosophically, then I know that some people are responsible for what they do. And I don't really have a better argument for that second premise other than I have this perception of the way things seem to me. And then it follows from 1 and 2 that free will exists. So we can talk about these arguments later in the Q&A if you want to. I'll go through them pretty quickly so we can talk about neuroscience. But that's one argument that I think is compelling. Another argument, if we kind of break down some of the components of moral responsibility, usually it concerns things like praise and blame. So these next 2 arguments are dealing specifically with praiseworthy actions and blameworthy actions. So if we think about our everyday experience again, it seems like some people do things, and it just seems like the way that they did it, the quality of will that they displayed when they performed that action, it just seems like they did the right thing and that they're praiseworthy for what they did. Or maybe if it's even like a supererogatory action that was not even required of them, but they went above and beyond. So that would seem like a praiseworthy action. And so if free will is necessary for an action to be praiseworthy and the action actually is praiseworthy, then it seems like free will exists. And this one, the culpability argument, I actually stole from Peter Van Inwagen. I mentioned our podcast earlier. We interviewed Peter in our first season, so a few years ago. And when we asked him to explain what the problem of free will is, he wanted to talk more about culpability. So if there's no free will, then nothing is ever anyone's fault. But it seems like that there are some things that are people's fault. And the examples that he gave in the interview were things like the Holocaust. So if there's no free will, there's nothing that's ever anybody's fault. And that means things like the Holocaust aren't anybody's fault. And that just seems kind of like a hard bullet to bite. So these last two are both related to moral responsibility, and they might all cash out into actually the same argument if we wanted to get nitpicky about it. So that's the culpability. For the next one also deals with moral responsibility, but I call it a theistic moral responsibility argument. So people who are theists, Muslims, Christians, and Jews that hold the theological view that God does hold us responsible. So however you cash that out, whether it's purgatory, hell, or rewards in heaven, if free will is the control necessary to be morally responsible, and you hold that belief that God holds people responsible, then you should believe that free will exists because God's perfectly just. So the only way he would not hold people responsible if they were responsible is if he wasn't just. So for theists, I think this is about as good as it gets as far as a proof for something. I've given this argument to some people, and they kind of don't want to call it a proof, but I'm thinking about the term proof in the sense that G.E. Moore uses it when he gives his proof against the global skeptical arguments. Like, here's a hand, here's another hand, therefore I have two hands. So if I know I have two hands, I know something, and that skepticism is false. So it's that kind of proof. The next argument, free will is connected to a lot of different kinds of goods besides moral responsibility. So things like love, and then other ones that I'll get to after this one. So if free will is necessary for love, so love relationships, and these genuine love relationships actually exist, then the thing that's required for them has to also exist. So free will would have to exist if love exists. And related to that, so we could have the friendship argument that free will is required for friendships, and we have genuine friendships. Another thing, friendship and love is very closely related, but another thing that a lot of philosophers think that is connected really tightly to free will is creativity. That there's this, when we engage in creative activity, we have a special kind of control over our behavior. So we could think of free will as the kind of control necessary for creative activities. And it does seem like people engage in a lot of different kinds of creative activities, whether it's art or music or even philosophical arguments would count as this. And so another argument for the existence of free will. This one has actually been a popular one in the history of the free will literature. So in the last 100 years, a lot of people go for what I would call the phenomenology argument. So it just seems to me, when I reflect on what I do, that I have genuine choices, and that I make genuine choices when I deliberate about what to do. I mean, just thinking about the phenomenology of what it feels like from the inside to deliberate and then make a choice. So the second premise there, I got from a philosopher named Michael Huemer at Colorado. So he calls this phenomenological conservatism. And the basic idea is just, unless we have some grounds for doubting our perceptions, then it's reasonable to assume that things are as they appear. And so my third premise is I just don't think there's any good positive grounds for doubting the way things seem to be with respect to the first premise, that I make genuine choices. So there are a lot of people would deny premise 3. The hard incompatibilists, sometimes they're called willusionists, the people who think that free will is an illusion. So they're going to say, well, yeah, it seems to you that you make genuine choices, just like it seems to you that there's water off in the distance when you perceive a mirage. And so they're going to argue against this premise and say that their arguments against free will are the positive grounds. I think that those arguments don't work. So depending on as you read these incompatibilist and anti-free will arguments, if those arguments are compelling to you, then premise 3 you think is just going to be false. But I don't think that those arguments are compelling. I think that they're serious arguments that we should take seriously, but I don't think they work because I think we have free will. All right, so that's the phenomenology argument. The reasons argument is linked to a certain kind of a view of free will, that free will is being responsive to reasons in the right way. So John Martin Fisher at UC Riverside is a person who holds to a view like this, where he thinks that free will is about being responsive, recognizing the reasons that are there, and then having the ability to respond to those reasons. And so it seems to me in premise 2 that we are responsive to reasons in the right way. So if you just look around at the way people behave, most people act. Most people are not irrational. Most people have reasons for why they do what they do. And if the reasons had been different, then they would have done differently. So another argument for free will. So I went really quickly through that. If you guys want to talk more about those arguments in the Q&A, we can, but I wanted to spend more time on the neuroscience. So I'm going to focus in on one specific neuroscientific experiment that's kind of like the most famous one, called the Libet experiment. And the way the Libet experiment worked is they put you can see the picture here, the EEG cap on a person's head that amplifies the brain waves, and then we have a readout over here of what's going on in their brain. And they were asked to perform an action, a really simple one. They were just talking about flexing their wrist. So you can see kind of the experimental setup where their hands resting on a rolled up towel. And then they were given a clock, and actually have, let me see if you guys can see this. Can you guys see this? Oh, it changed.
Yep.
Let me click to enlarge. So this is the clock that the people were told to look at, and you can see the dot kind of moves pretty quickly around. And they were told to watch that clock. And then when they felt the urge or intention or desire to flex their wrist, then they were told to notice the position of the dot on the clock when they felt that urge to move, and then move their wrist, and then write down or relay to the experimenter where the position of the clock was when they felt the urge, and then they would notice when they actually moved. All right, let me go back to my slides. So here's what they found. This is called the wave that you see. Libet named the readiness potential. And you see here, the moment of action is 0 milliseconds. The rise of the readiness potential was 550 milliseconds. So really quickly before, but almost half a second. I mean, that's quick, but it's almost half a second. And then W is this bar right here, is their conscious awareness of their intention. And it's important to know that when Libet instructed the participants on what they were doing, he specifically told them, like, when you feel the urge or the intention, and he used a couple of other words. So there were several different words that he used. When you feel that, that's when you want to notice where the clock was. And notice, like, there's this rise in brain activity that begins about half a second before the action, and then the conscious awareness of that intention is 200 milliseconds. So the rise of readiness, the brain activity begins before the conscious awareness of their intention or their urge to move. Now, this experiment there's been tons written about this experiment. So I'm not adding anything new here. I'm just kind of giving you guys the the overview of how the argument has gone since then. And some people have said that because the brain activity happens right here before you're consciously aware of the brain activity, or consciously aware of your intention or your urge to move, then this casts doubt on whether or not we have free will. And so we could reconstruct the argument for why we might doubt free will based on this experiment like this. So the first premise, if the brain causes your decision before you're aware, you're consciously aware of that decision, then that decision isn't free. And this premise, the idea is, excuse me. Sorry about that. The idea is that free will involves conscious activity. So when I deliberate, it's for us to have free will, it seems like I need to be consciously aware of the things that I'm deliberating about. And so their worry is, well, it seems there's all this brain activity that's happening that you're not aware of. So if all of this stuff is unconscious and you don't actually consciously deliberate about what you think you're deliberating about, then they think that you're not free. The second premise, the brain causes your decision before you're consciously aware of it. So if we go back, this readiness potential, the rise, this is the idea that this rise in brain activity is the brain causing what you're going to do before you're consciously aware of it. So these two premises together lead to the sub-conclusion that your decision isn't free. So in the specific case where they're told to flex their wrist, Libet and others thought that this was enough evidence to show that these actions, the decision to flex the wrist, were not free. So there's a deductive part of this argument and an inductive argument part of this argument. The deductive part is 1 through 3, that this particular action in the Libet experiment was not free. The next part is an inductive step, because it doesn't help if we're going to try to make a case against free will in general, then we don't need to just say that you're not free with that specific action, because that's not enough. You need to generalize from that and say that none of your actions are free. And so that's what some people take this inductive step to say, that all of your other decisions are just like the decision in the Libet experiment, just like flexing your wrist. And because that decision's not free, then none of our decisions are free. So that's the basic idea. If we want to respond to this argument, there's several different ways that we can respond to it. One way to respond to it is we could go through and maybe I could give you reasons to doubt each one of the premises and each step of the argument. So here's one. The first thing that comes to mind for me is, why think that unconscious decisions are unfree decisions? So if this requires the view that all free decisions must be conscious decisions. And I think that we have reasons to doubt this step in the argument, this premise. And I have a couple of examples. So some actions that we perform are unconscious actions. I don't know if you've ever experienced driving home and you start daydreaming as you drive home, and then all of a sudden you're at your driveway or you're next to your house, and you don't remember all of the actions that you performed to get there. So, you had to turn left or you turn right, put the brakes on when somebody was in front of you. So there's a bunch of different actions that larger action of driving home is composed of. And it seems like, at least in some cases, those are unconscious actions that we perform. So some actions where there's a larger action that's composed of smaller actions become automatic with repetition and practice. It's just the way the brain works, because the brain likes to conserve its capacity. So our brain has the capacity to focus on only a few things at a time. And so if we were focused on everything that we did all the time, we would miss a lot of stuff. So our brain is designed in order to move some things that we've done a bunch to like this automatic stage. And if you've ever played a sport, the driving example is one where you've driven home the same way so many times that it becomes automatic and you don't have to think about it. If you've ever played a sport, it's like that too. So when you first learn a sport, you have to really focus on your body moving through space and what you're trying to do to learn the skill. And then when you're playing against other people, you have to consciously think about what the other people are doing so you know how to adjust your behavior. In the beginning, there's a lot of consciousness involved. I'm thinking about when I played basketball in high school and like when they taught us how to shoot free throws, there was a lot of conscious activity, and they told us to try to do the exact same thing over and over and over again, where you have the same repetitive action at the beginning, right before you shoot the free throw, to the point where it becomes automatic because you've shot so many of them. Or any elite athlete, if you ask them what was going on in their head while they were doing things, it's going to be different than somebody who's not an elite athlete. So these kinds of actions become automatic. And just one example, I'm thinking of like in the Super Bowl, for instance, when Patrick Mahomes performed some kind of stellar touchdown pass or something like that. And you ask him, well, like, what was going through your head? And he might respond by saying, oh, like, I didn't even think about it. I just did it. Like, there was no conscious decision for me to throw the ball in that location at that time. I reacted to the situation because he's had so much training that it just becomes automatic. So those are some kinds of actions that we might think are still free, even though they're not, even though they're unconscious, or they don't involve a lot of conscious deliberation. Another class of actions, the consciousness is what I want to say is front loaded. And what I mean by that is that conscious deliberation, all the conscious aspects of it comes days, weeks, maybe even months prior to the decision. So if you ever think about a decision that you made that was a life-changing decision, like who you were going to marry, or what college you were going to go to, or what career you want to pursue, those aren't the kind of decisions that you just make up your mind on the spur of the moment, like whether you're going to have tacos or a cheeseburger. So those kinds of decisions involve a lot of deliberation over an extended period of time. And you might, because you've been thinking about it for months, you might just wake up one day and your mind is made up. And that day, you didn't consciously deliberate it or consciously think about it at all. But all the conscious deliberation was front loaded. It happened in the days and weeks and months prior to that. So we might say that that's a kind of decision that didn't involve conscious deliberation at the moment of action or the moment of decision, but it still seems like it's a free one, or we don't have reason to doubt that it's a free one because of all the conscious deliberation that was front loaded. So that's some reasons to doubt premise one. Just because a decision is not, we're not consciously aware of our decision, doesn't necessarily mean that that is an unfree action. Premise two, I think that we have reason to doubt this one too. So what's going on in this unconscious brain activity? Like if we were to go back and look at the readiness potential here. In Libet's experiment, as I said before, the subjects were instructed to recall the clock position at the time of their initial awareness of their intention or their urge or their desire to move their wrist. So one question you might ask, and this is where philosophers come in and start talking about terminology. What do you mean by all these terms? So Libet used all of these terms: intention, urge, decision, desire. So what do we mean by all these things? So in the philosophical literature, what we mean by those things is very different. And if we were to do some folk psychology and ask people what they mean by that, then that's going to be very different too. So the readiness potential might be an urge, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's an intention to act. Because I can have urges to do all kinds of things. Like you've probably felt the urge to do things that you thought better of and didn't do. Like if somebody makes you angry, you just want to punch them, but you fight that urge and you form the intention to refrain from punching them instead. So it seems like we need a lot more clarity on what exactly is going on in this readiness potential. There's other experiments that were done in the same vein as Libet's experiment. So other ones, the subjects, instead of flexing their wrist, the subjects were told to press one of two buttons, and they were told not to decide to press the button until after they heard a beep. And in those experiments, there's no difference in the EEG readings between those who pressed one button rather than the other. And the average time between the decision and the muscle burst, so they had electrodes plugged into their arms so they could see exactly when the electrical impulses were causing the muscles to move. The average time between the decision to move and the muscle burst was only negative 150 milliseconds. So it was less than the W time. And so what this seems to show is that when we see different kind of readiness potentials and different kind of brain activity in different experiments, we need a lot more evidence in order to conclude that we have no free will. All right, so that gives us reason to doubt premise 1 and premise 2. So of course, if the premises of an argument are false, then it's not a good argument, and we can't get to the conclusion that that particular decision is not free. And so that kind of wrecks the whole argument. But I think that there's reasons to deny the generalization too. Even if, let's just grant the deductive part of the argument and say, maybe our reasons to doubt premise 1 and premise 2, maybe they're not good enough. So let's, for the sake of the argument, let's give them 1 through 3 and say the decision in the experiment was not a free one. I think we still have reasons to doubt the inductive part of this argument. I want to deny this generalization. Just because the action in the Libet experiment was unfree, I don't think we can generalize to all of our actions. Just think about it. Why think that all actions are like button presses and wrist flexes? Agents really don't deliberate about what they're supposed to do in these experiments. They're told what to do. You either flex your wrist now or you flex your wrist later. The only thing they're deliberating about is when to do it. And I don't think that this is the way most of our actions are at least the kind of actions that we want to say exemplify free will in the best kind of way. They're not like button presses and wrist flexes, because there's nothing matters about button presses and wrist flexes. When you're consciously deliberating about what you want to do, usually it's because something hangs on that decision. It matters. Like those actions that I mentioned before, like if you're deciding who you want to marry or whether you want to marry your girlfriend or boyfriend or significant other, if you're deciding what college to go to, if you've been accepted to more than one college, if you're trying to decide what major to major in, these are way different than pressing a button or flexing a wrist. Something significant hangs on this. And so if we want to have a generalization to this conclusion that none of our decisions are free, then we need to be studying these kinds of decisions too, and not just the kinds of decisions that don't matter, like button presses and wrist flexes. One area in neuroscience that has progressed since Libet, so Libet performed these experiments back in the 80s. In the last probably 10 to 15 years, some neuroscientists have been trying to correct for this particular problem in the Libet experiment. And one neuroscientist that we actually had on our podcast named Uri Maus, he teaches at Chapman University I think it's in Orange. It's in the greater LA area. He set up an experiment that was similar as far as like the readout of the brain activity. And instead of having meaningless actions like press the right button or the left button or flex your wrist whenever you feel the urge to flex your wrist, he had them choose between the two buttons, but connected something of significance to their button press. So in one of his experiments, it was donating to charity. So they selected people who cared about donating to charity. They care about social issues. They care about voting. So these people think that this decision that they're going to make matters. And they're told, if you press the right button, then we're going to donate some money to the charity on the right. And if you press the left button, we're going to donate to the charity on the left. And then these charities were significantly different. Like one of them might be, you don't want to save the whales. And then another one, you want to save starving children in third world countries. So these are two very different charities. One of them is animal rights activists might choose, and another one, people who care about third world countries might choose. And in the decision, there was I think there was $1,000, and they told them that one of the participants in this experiment, when you press that button, we're actually going to donate the money to that charity. Now you don't know which participant is going to be the one, so you need to take this seriously. It might be you, so you want to make sure you choose the charity that you care most about. And so they perform this experiment, and go back to the readiness potential in the Libet kind of experiments. When there's nothing of significance about their choice, you see the nice readiness potential. I don't have a slide for this one, but Uri said that in his experiment there was no readiness potential, or no significant readiness potential. And so this seems to cast doubt on the generalization here, that all of our decisions are just like that one. It seems pretty clear that all of our decisions are not like that one. And neuroscientists now make a distinction between what they call picking and what they call choosing. So the Libet experiment actions are paradigmatic cases of picking, where nothing of significance matters on this choice. And these kinds of cases are when you go to the grocery store and you need to buy a gallon of milk, and the gallons on the shelf are identical. They have the same expiration date. They're the same, milk fat percentage, the same brand. So it doesn't matter which one you choose. You just pick one. But when the choosing is different, and instead of choosing between things that are not significantly different, choosing is between cases where there are differences, like whether you're going to donate to save the whales or whether you're going to donate to save children in third world countries. And there's actually different systems in the brain that are responsible for these different kinds of choices, whether it's picking or choosing. So that's some reasons to deny the generalization. And overall, I don't want to pick on Libet too much, because I think that I'll say some nice things about Libet after critiquing this. This actually wasn't Libet's argument. This is a way of framing the argument from Libet's experiments. The experiments that he did, I think are significant, and they're very influential in both neuroscience and in the philosophy of free will. So I think that we want to say that a lot of what he did matters, and a lot of what he did was good work. But it's just the people who come after him and try to say things like, well, Libet, almost 40 years now, is it 40 years ago? Yeah, somewhere around in there, proved that there's no free will. I think that the case is overblown. And I think the case in general, the case from neuroscience against free will is overblown. So I think this is a good place to stop, and we can pause and see what questions you guys have. I'd be glad to go to any part of the slides if you want to look at them again, and I'm interested to hear what you guys think.
Gotcha. Thanks a bunch for presenting. Yeah, I got a couple as well, and I'll give others a chance to ask questions as well. So regarding your podcast, you said you had Dr. Peter Van Inwagen
Yeah.
on your podcast. My understanding is that he's a libertarian about free will. Is that correct?
Well, I think Van Inwagen's a complicated case.
Hmm.
I don't think he would classify himself as a libertarian. He does classify himself as an incompatibilist. So in the literature, libertarianism is a conjunction of two different theses. One is incompatibilism, that free will is incompatible with determinism, and another thesis that we actually do have free will. And so he agrees with the incompatibilism part, but he's unsure of whether or not we have free will. And a lot of people call him a Mysterian. When we asked him about it, he thinks that he's kind of moved away from thinking and writing about free will because he thinks the problem is too hard. He thinks that There are significant arguments against libertarianism, and he thinks that there's significant arguments against compatibilism, which is the view that free will is compatible with determinism. And he thinks that we are culpable. We're morally responsible for what we do. And so when you have those three together, we've got like an inconsistent set that there's compelling arguments against libertarianism. There's compelling arguments against compatibilism, which are the two main theories of free will. So it doesn't seem like we have free will, but it seems like we're morally responsible for what we do. So he's not sure which part of the three goes wrong.
Gotcha. I see. Has Alvin Plantinga been on your podcast?
No.
Um,
Plantinga doesn't really write too much about free will specifically. He has mentioned it a few times, but he writes mostly about epistemology and philosophy of religion.
Gotcha. And it's my understanding that he doesn't write much nowadays, like period. I mean,
Yeah, that's true.
makes sense given like,
Yeah.
his age. Do
Yeah.
you maybe you know the answer to this? So I was reading one of his popular level books, God, Freedom, and Evil, I think it's what it was called.
Yeah.
Does that name
Yeah.
sound familiar?
I
Yeah,
know
yeah.
the book. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And he was going over not a theodicy, he doesn't call it a theodicy, but defense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in his argument, I wasn't sure like what version of free will he was defending, if he was defending like a libertarian free will
Yeah.
or compatibilist free will. What do you think? Or does he just leave it open like it is what it is?
Yeah.
Just
In that book, he specifically makes use of libertarian free will.
gotcha. Okay.
I'm
I
pretty
see.
sure he's a libertarian. Every time I've ever heard him talk about or read him speaking, writing about compatibilism, he makes fun of compatibilism and thinks that
Mm,
it's like a non-starter.
gotcha. Yeah, I haven't read much on Flanagan's work on libertarianism, but I do know Richard Swinburne
Mm-hmm.
has criticized like him not distinguishing between what type of free will like he's advocating for, because to me it seemed kind of ambiguous, right? So in his book, what is it called? Providence and the Problem of Evil,
Mm-hmm.
one of his criticisms when he's like building up his theodicy is like it's not clear what version of free will he's advocating for, and he just differentiates between like serious free will, very serious free will, and like free will that isn't serious. And he argues, of course, that very serious free will, I think, is the one that delivers the most good, most meaningful good. But all right, yeah, I mean, I haven't read his more professional works. I've only read two of his books. But all right. One last one, and then I'll let others ask questions. So it's interesting that you mentioned Dr. Michael Humer because he's been with us twice
Oh
before.
yeah. Uh-huh.
The first time was in the spring semester to discuss his argument for his syllogism for ethical vegetarianism, which I thought was really interesting. And then this semester for his ontological proof for moral realism.
Yeah.
Um, and I liked how it was like a play on the ontological argument, but
Yeah.
in his words, it's like it's the ontological argument, but it actually works.
Yeah,
Is what he said. Uh,
that's funny.
I'm still trying to figure him out though, because I know he wrote a paper that I think is pretty accessible. I think it's called like a proof of free will or moral proof of free will. Um, does that sound familiar?
I'm not familiar with that one. I've read some of his stuff, but I'll have to check that out because I don't think I've ever read that one.
Gotcha. Well, I read that paper and I think I mean, it's just really accessible to read. But then the problem I ran into, and it's not just him, I think it's just, it happens a lot, is like not differentiating between like what types of free will is being advocated for. So you brought up a syllogism by Dr. Humer a while ago in one of your slides. I don't know if you can pull that up, but is
Yeah,
that,
that it's not actually Humer's argument. I just make use of in premise two. I just get this from him. The
oh,
phenomenal
phenomenal
conservatism.
conservatism. Yes, I
Yeah.
see that. Yeah,
And
I think
he uses it for different things. So
right. I my personal view is that phenomenal conservatism, I mean, just the way I think we think of the world nowadays.
yeah.
I mean, I think it's just how we behave. But all right, I'll let others ask questions if they wish to ask questions. And if not, we can call it a meeting.
I have a question.
right?
Go ahead.
My question involves more of the premise that things could have been different. In other words, the idea that you, as a free will agent, could have done something differently, and you chose to do it this certain way. In that regard, on the same, let's just say, premises that Robert Sapolsky and Sam Harris use, is this idea that there's this causal chain of actions going on that are physical, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we get environmental stimulus, which then, of course, there is thinking, there is this processing going on. I won't deny that. I don't think that can be denied. But however, that is, they claim, is fixed according to many different factors, being whatever neurotransmitters you may have. Maybe if you're hungry, right? Or maybe if you just got in a fight with your wife, or if maybe you are lonely, you don't have anyone to. So all these things, in addition to that, let's just say state that happens to then make you have a causal reaction to something. The idea that you could have done it otherwise is one of the things that I find questionable, at least in regards to, well, could it really have been otherwise? Because if it's a physical causal chain of reactions that are going on, then how could we even come up with some kind of empirical experiment to prove otherwise?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I want to say, I guess, two main things. One of them, I actually just read a review of Sapolsky's book today.
Okay.
John Martin Fisher reviewed it in the Notre Dame Philosophical Review, and John Martin Fisher is a really nice guy, and so to the tone of the article was kind of tame with respect to most people, but it was pretty brutal as far as Fisher's normal, what's the word I'm looking for? Like the way he writes. He thinks that Sapolsky doesn't take seriously the literature on free will and philosophy. Like he says that the book is worth it for the science, but it left much to be desired as far as the philosophy. And I've actually written a review of Sam Harris's book. And I think Sam Harris is a little bit more philosophically minded, but I think he also doesn't take seriously the what philosophers have said for, the last 100 years. So when it comes to the causal chain stuff, there is some evidence from science that there is that kind of deterministic causal chain. Like, given some starting initial conditions, the laws of nature, the way things are at a moment in time is going to causally ensure that the way things are later. And that's just the way a lot of people define causal determinism. So the problem is that there's also evidence from science that our world is not like that. At this point, the jury's still out. So let's put it that way. Some scientists think that determinism is true, and some scientists think that it's not. And I'm not sure. I don't have the scientific credentials to be able to weigh in on that debate. I'm just waiting for the physicists and other scientists to continue to do their experiments and see if they can answer that question. But at this point, I think it would be premature to say that we know for sure that determinism is true, especially when it comes to human behavior. So that would be one point that I would want to make as far as your question, that we do have reasons to doubt that determinism is true, and that we should wait before we say that. The other thing I want to say is, even if determinism is true, there are some philosophical theories of free will and moral responsibility that would work just fine, even if determinism is true. And John Martin Fisher is one of those. So his book, Responsibility and Control, is fantastic. And he thinks that determinism would rule out the ability to do otherwise. So he would agree with you.
Okay.
And say things like, well, yeah, that's true. Like, if determinism is true, we wouldn't have the ability. He calls it regulative control. We wouldn't have the ability to do other than what we actually did. Because, if determinism is true and we have these initial conditions, then you're going to do the same thing every single time you're in those initial conditions. But he thinks we can salvage moral responsibility. And so I'm not even going to try to summarize the whole book, but the idea is that I mentioned him when I talked about the reasons responsive argument, that as long as we're responsive to reasons, if we can recognize the reasons that are there, especially moral reasons, and we can respond to them in an appropriate range of possible worlds, then we're morally responsible for what we do. And this is true even if determinism is true. And so that's just one theory of free will.
Now that's Fisher.
Theory.
What's his first name?
John Martin Fisher.
John Martin. Okay, I'll look into that.
Yeah, and his book's called Responsibility and Control.
Okay.
He also participated in a Four Views book with Dirk Pereboom, Manuel Vargas, and Robert Kane. And so he kind of condenses the whole book into one chapter. So that might be worth it.
Okay.
And then Robert Kane has an excellent version of libertarian free will in there. Dirk Pereboom is the hard incompatibilist. He argues that nobody has free will and nobody's responsible for anything. And then Manuel Vargas argues for a position called revisionism when it comes to responsibility and free will. Got somebody at my door. Hang on just a second.
No worries.
So we're gonna have to cut this. I guess it's the end of the meeting.
Right. I'll say my goodbyes once he's back.
Yeah, of course we're gonna say goodbye. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And do you have any other questions, David?
I mean, if I could ask questions for hours and hours and hours.
Yeah, I know
hours,
we could be
we don't
here
have
all
time for
night.
that. We don't have time for that.
Yeah.
So I'm so sorry.
Oh, it's
No
okay.
worries.
It was perfect timing because we're out of time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks a bunch for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
I will upload this to our YouTube and I'll send it to you ahead of time if that's what you'd like. But thanks a bunch. It was an honor having you with us.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm honored to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Right.
This was
Thank you so much.
a lot of fun.
That was a
Awesome.
great talk. Great talk. Thank
Take
you.
care.
Okay.
Bye.
You have a happy Thanksgiving, holidays, and whatnot.
All right, you too.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.